Welcome to the Leesburg Public Library. Today is exciting because this is our first hybrid program, and I'd like to thank the Friends of the Leesburg Library for making it possible by providing the funding for our technology and our equipment that we needed to be able to provide programs that we have the presenter here live or via Zoom, and you get to choose. Today we're hosting Rick Kilby. He's the author of Florida Healing Waters, and this is his bio. Fresh out of college in 1988, he started working as a graphic designer at a publishing company in Gainesville. He worked his way up to creative director at Church Street Station during almost a decade of employment, and was then hired as creative manager at Arnold Palmer Golf Management. Please join me in welcoming Rick Kilby.
So these are people coming from the north, coming to Florida for healthful reasons. And my story is about 150 years old. People came here because they believed in the power of the sunshine and they believed in the power of the water. Florida's blessed with over 1,000 freshwater springs, miles and miles of beach, and we have tons of lakes, and a lot of the lakes, or some of the lakes, had sanitariums. And so I want to talk about what happened 150 years ago to draw these people to Florida, and why people like Annie Oakley. Well, Annie Oakley didn't come here for health. She came here, well, I guess she did come here for her health. She was older when she came here. You're welcome to take a copy of Reflections magazine with my story in there. It was fun to research. So before Florida became a big tourist destination in the early 1800s, it was known about by invalids. And one of the most famous invalids was Ralph Waldo Emerson, the famous transcendentalist and writer, who had consumption. And I will talk a little bit more about consumption of tuberculosis on the next slide, but he meant to go as far as Savannah, and somehow he ended up coming all the way to St. Augustine. And he spent several months in St. Augustine, and he wrote extensively about his experiences there. He had a wide array of things happened to him. He talks about being bored and walking on the beach and hitting an orange with a stick. And he talks about going to a prayer meeting, and right next to the prayer meeting was a slave auction. So this is 1827. Florida is not yet a state. It is a U.S. territory, but it still has legal slavery. And he talks about how different this experience is. But after a few months, he went back up north, and he lived a very long life despite having tuberculosis. And tuberculosis was one of the main reasons people came to Florida. So here are some mind-blowing stats. In the year 1800, 1 out of every 7 person people who have ever lived on the planet Earth had died from tuberculosis. In 1851, 1 out of 4 deaths in the United States and Europe was caused by tuberculosis. They called it the White Death, and it was way worse than the pandemic, and there are still people with tuberculosis today. It was such an issue that eventually they would find the cause in the 19th century, but their best guess as to how to deal with the disease with all these consumptives was to spend time outside in fresh air and exercise. And so Florida had a huge advantage because of the warm sunshine in winter. People could come here when it was difficult to be outside up north. They could come to Florida. People who had money could afford to come to Florida. Poor people were still out of luck. The cities were getting polluted. It was the middle of the Industrial Revolution. So people who could escape to the mountains or mineral springs or beaches tended to do so. And Florida, after the Civil War, became a haven for consumptives. And you started seeing guidebooks like this, Going South for the Winter with Hints for Consumptives, written in 1873. And here, this is from my public library in Orlando. This is just a selection of a few of the 19th century references they have, first edition on the shelf, that were guidebooks for people after the Civil War to come to Florida. So there was a big multimedia press. There was postcards from Florida. There was stereograph images. There were getting a lot of publicity in magazines and newspapers. So people were coming here in large numbers. Another aspect of that to consider is that there was a lot of money to be made off of invalids. And I love this quote because many of the people who were coming down were people who were investors from the north who were building these big spas that I'm going to show you some pictures of, but also just a regular guy, like this Florida cracker here. William Derrick Paley wrote this book called Old South and the New, and he came across this guy tilling his field, and he thought the crops looked so pathetic. He saw no way this guy could ever make a living. So he said, well, how do you get by? And the guy tilling the field said, we get by on sweet potatoes and some Yankees. And he said, what do you have to sell? He said, we have to sell our atmosphere. Everybody was in on it. And there was a lot of money to be made from invalids. And so my whole theory that I want to put forward is that today, much of our economy in the state of Florida is based on tourism and people coming to the state. Well, its origins, part of the origins or part of that aspect is medical tourism back in the 19th century. And it was a big part of people coming to Florida. But I also want to make sure that I'm clear that not everybody who came here was invalids. It was just a portion of the people traveling here. And they came here to take the waters. And taking the waters is a practice that people still do all over the globe, and they've been doing it for thousands of years, where you bathe in mostly mineral waters and you drink the mineral waters to improve your health. And it goes back to ancient cultures across the globe. And Florida was perfect for places to take the waters because we have over 1,000 freshwater springs, and many of them have high degrees of mineral. How many people here have had sulfur water? And you know how it smells, you know how it tastes. It was believed sulfur water was good for you. So if they came across a spring that had that sulfur smell, and you could tell that it was sulfur water, many cases they developed in the springs. So these are the 22 springs I talk about in my book. The ones in the kind of rusty color on the right side of Florida were ones that were reliant on steamboat traffic going up and down the St. Johns River. And they tended to be developed first because of the steamboat traffic that was moving up and down that river. The ones in the blue are the ones in North Florida that tended to develop during the era of railroads, because that center portion of the state really didn't develop until railroads could get people there. And then the ones in green are just a hodgepodge of different resorts along the Gulf, where some were reliant on boat traffic, some were reliant on steamboat, and some really didn't develop until the age of the automobile, which by that time, what I call Florida's golden age of bathing was already waning. So now I want to talk a little bit about the history of taking the waters. Cultures across the globe throughout history believe water is sacred, and there's spirituality connected to water. So the ancient Greeks would build temples in mineral springs, and they believed that it was the gods and goddesses of the water that would make the water special, and you could get healing by bathing in water. The ancient Romans came along and they built these immaculate baths. And the baths of Caracalla are one of the biggest sites you can see in Rome. The one I went to is the Roman baths in Bath, England, which started out by the Romans and then became used by more contemporary people in the 1700s and 1800s. And all that is still there. In fact, they have a modern spa where you can still take the waters there today and drink the waters as well. It's a UNESCO heritage site, and if you get a chance to go to England, you gotta go to Bath. It's one of my wife's and I's favorite places to visit. But they've been taking the waters there uninterrupted for hundreds and hundreds of years. That whole bathing culture almost died out during the Dark Ages, as we kind of lost some of the connection to the classics of cultures of Rome and Greece, and then they were rediscovered during the Renaissance. And during the Enlightenment, a new bathing culture emerged. Some of it was based at places that had big Roman baths, like Baden-Baden in Germany, and places we know for mineral water, like Perrier in France, started out as spa towns. And so people who weren't just invalids, but people who were wealthy people went there because that's what cultured people did during that time period. They went to bathe and take the waters at these watering places, as they were called. Eventually, that culture came to America, as you know, we were very much connected with Europe and England, I should say. So England had a very long bathing tradition. So you started seeing places establish that bathing culture in places like Hot Springs, Arkansas, Saratoga Springs, New York, and this is Warm Springs, Virginia. My favorite place to go in this country to take the water, because that same bathhouse that is there today was used by Thomas Jefferson for 9 days. He took the waters. And so there's that long interrupted tradition. And that's my wife, and we were there. She was worried the whole time that the building was going to fall on her. Not long after that, they closed it, and now it's still closed because they're rehabbing it, fortunately, because there's an incredible connection of history. The biggest place in the country, though, in terms of watering places, was by far Santo Springs. The whole town revolved around the watering places. And, they're known for their horse races, and people were there spending money, vacationing there because of the waters there. Eventually, that tradition came to Florida, and the European tradition was actually new compared to the ancient tradition of the indigenous people who lived here. We know that the Timucua people who lived in the central and northern portion of the state had a word for water called Idi, I-D-I, and that was for all forms of water. And they saw a deep connection with themselves and nature. And we know that later people who came, like the Seminoles who came in the 1700s, were mostly Creeks and other tribes who moved into Florida, believed that our springs were sacred. So if they were fighting somebody else, they came in the presence of the spring, it was considered an oasis of peace, and that nobody except for the sick could live near a spring, according to this Seminole tradition. So this is what part of the European tradition, when people started taking advantage of the springs of Florida, this is what the facilities looked like. They were quite crude, these little wooden buildings, and this was probably the spring run at Green Cove Springs. Has anybody been to Green Cove Springs? It's a small little town about 30 minutes from St. Augustine on the St. Johns River. And you can see it's kind of shanty town at this point, but it would eventually become the hub of all watering places on the St. Johns. But this is some visitors to Florida, probably in the 1870s or 1880s. And I showed this slide for a couple of reasons. One, you can see that they're very well dressed, so they're wealthy. These are wealthy people coming to Florida. Two, to point out that they're coming in winter. This was before air conditioning. People did not come to Florida in summer. The state season was from December or January through April or May. And so that's when these large numbers of people are coming here. And I just love this because there is a whole culture of steamboat travel up and down the St. Johns River. There was also steamboats along the Gulf, on the Apalachicola and Swanee, but the main place that had these beautiful riverboats was the St. Johns River. And these are two typical people who came. They came in 1897. Charles Kyer was a brewer from Pennsylvania. He was a millionaire in the 1890s, so that tells you how wealthy he was. And he had some kind of lung ailment. So he came here and they landed in Jacksonville, and that became the hub of their visits. And they spent time in St. Augustine. They went up and down the St. Johns River. They went to Swanee Springs in order to take the waters, and they went as far south as Indian River, and then spent 2 months just kind of hopping around the state, which took a lot of money because they were going from steamboat to train and just moving around the entire time. Railroad travel was a big part of this. It wasn't just steamboats. In the 1880s on, that opened up a whole portion of the state. And I showed this slide again to show the amount of luxury, because these people expected the accommodations to be high class and high end. This is what it looked like. And the port of entry early on was Jacksonville. And Jacksonville was a boom town that exploded after the Civil War. For most of the Civil War, there were Union troops in Jacksonville. So when they went back up north, they talked about how wonderful the winters were. And they told all the people up north, and they started coming down. And of course, there's a port there that makes it easily accessible from, people would take a steamer from New York to Charleston to Savannah and then to Jacksonville, or Fernandina Beach, which was another place where Civil War, Northern troops were stationed during the Civil War. And from there, you could get a train or a steamer and go up the St. Johns River. And to clarify, going south is up on the St. Johns River because it flows north. So this is, I love this stat that, there were 350 residents in 1840, but by the turn of the century, there were 70,000 visitors coming every year to Jacksonville. And the first big watering place you would see would be Green Cove Springs. And that's where everybody went. This was ground zero for the watering culture in Florida. This is where everyone went. And I love this image. I want to point out a couple things. Can you see the guy with the big box behind him in the foreground? That's a camera. And that's an early photographer. And that's a huge, probably 8x10 glass plate negative camera. Something like what probably took this photograph. You can see the spring itself there off to the right behind the lady with the parasol. That's the spring boil. Then the spring flows to the left. And that white picket fence area is a bathing area that's got a fence around it for privacy. Men and women generally didn't bathe at the same time, so they either had separate bathing areas or separate bathing times. So, and then there was, that hut there may be to pump the water into the hotel. The big hotel there was called the Clarendon, and I'll show you that later. So this is Green Cove Springs. I love this because all that exists because of this tiny little third magnitude spring, which springs are classified in terms of magnitudes. The big ones like Sulphur Springs and Rainbow Springs are first magnitude. Wakulla Springs is first magnitude. This is a third magnitude spring, which means it's relatively small, but all that popped up because people came here to take the waters. So look at all the steamboats and the sailboats all along the river, and they're there because of the culture of the spring. On the right-hand side, that is another facility called Magnolia Springs. Magnolia Springs, it's hard to tell if they actually ever had a spring or not. They may have had a small spring, but they drilled a series of wells around the property for people to bathe in and drink the water. And you can see in that picture on the left that people are drinking water from what is probably an artesian well. And an artesian well is water with enough pressure that it doesn't need a pump to flow. And there was so little demand on our aquifer at the time, you basically dig a hole in the ground and the water would flow up to the surface. And Magnolia Springs kind of set the bar for resort hotels at Springs, even though there wasn't perhaps not really a spring there at all. So this is another shot of Green Cove Springs from the opposite direction. The first photo I showed you was facing the St. Johns River. This is the opposite side of the river, facing the Clarendon Hotel. And the point I like to make with this image is that in this advertising on the left, it calls it Green Cove Warm Sulphur Springs. They called it Warm Sulphur Springs because it's winter and 72 degrees or 78 degrees seems warm if it's 35 degrees outside. And it's an important distinction that, and it seems bizarre today because when we go to Florida Springs, or when I go to Florida Springs, they seem freezing, but they call them warm springs. And because they come from they're not affected by the air temperature, they're a constant state. And they range from 68 degrees to about 78 degrees. 72 is probably the average. So a lot of these people are not in the woods. They're coming here because that's what you did when you had money in this time period. And you went to these places all around the state and you wanted activities to do other than taking the waters. And you would bathe and you would drink copious amounts of the water, and then you would bathe again and drink more water. But in between, you had to have stuff to do. So the postcard on the top left, the note written at the bottom said, "This is where we got our ice cream." So there was always a lot of shopping options. Hunting and fishing were very big in that time period for Florida. They loved to hunt alligators. In some of the accounts written at the end of the 19th century, they talk about how they've almost hunted the alligators to extinction because they just shot them for no reason at all. To actually pull them out of the water was actually rare. And then there was a lot of boat excursions. You go up the little creeks and tributaries of the St. Johns River. So there was a lot to do. Oh, let me go back a couple of slides. Another thing that was really popular was promenading, where you would go on these long walks and dress up. And if you were a single lady, you could be spotted by a potential husband. And you could see the area they were promenading in Green Cove Springs along the shore of the river, going all the way up to Magnolia Springs. And that's called St. David's Path, or Lover's Walk, where people would go and promenade back and forth, which was a thing you saw at these spa towns again and again and again. So the big Clarendon Hotel burned down around the turn of the century. They replaced it with a Mediterranean revival masonry structure called the KC Sauna. And eventually that was torn down. But the city there built this new facility in 2017, and it's still open to the public. That's the spring. The fence area is relatively new, and then the water is piped into a swimming pool, and then there's a small spring around that goes into the St. Johns River. And it's open basically just in summer months. The only vestige of that spa time, that golden age of bathing, is they have one of the cottages associated with the Clarendon Hotel that's a bed and breakfast there today. So Green Cove Springs, we were talking about Blacken before. I see Green Cove Springs the same way. It's a small old port of town that has a lot of potential to grow, and there's a lot of development starting to happen around it. And I think it's going to grow and expand and be a very different place in a couple of years. This is one of the springs that was really reliant on railroad traffic to grow. This is White Sulphur Springs on the Swine River. There were two springs, Upper Mineral Springs and Lower Mineral Springs. I believe this is Lower Mineral Springs on the east side of the Swanee River. And it was really developed by a Confederate widow named Minnie Mosher Jackson, I believe was her name. And she hired, her brother was a doctor, and so they wanted to turn it into a spa. And she hired this architectural firm to build this beautiful, imposing structure you see here. And this spring house is probably the grandest structure from this era. You can see the bottom part is concrete, and then there's just 3 or 4 stories of people. And I can't believe all the bathers in this picture. It blows me away. And like Green Cove Springs, a whole town kind of developed around taking the waters there. And it was a very popular place. They bottled the water and sold the water. This building had a concession stand. It had changing rooms. It had an elevator. And it was here until the 1970s, and it was torn down. But they left the concrete part. And then just one of the stories was kind of recreated along the top. The sad thing about like Sulphur Springs is phosphate mining started happening in that area, and phosphate mining requires a great deal of water. The water from the spring is diverted, and so for most parts of the year, the spring is dry. When there's large rain events that happen and there's a lot of water in the water table, it will come and flow again briefly, but for the most part, it's dry. And that's part of Stephen Foster State Park in the little town of White Springs. It's a very, it's very interesting place to visit because you can see some of the older buildings from that time period, but it's a very quiet town. You may not see another soul when you're there. Another interesting place. So this is a spring that spa place on the Gulf Coast. It's directly east of Clearwater on Tampa Bay. It's in the town of Safety Harbor. Espiritu Santo was what DeSoto called Tampa Bay when he arrived there, the Bay of the Holy Spirit. So they named it Espiritu Santo Springs. And its origin story goes, there was a guy named Bailey who was a colonel in the Seminole War stationed in Fort Brooke in Tampa. And the story is that he had a Seminole prisoner who was wounded, and the Seminole prisoner showed him the location of the spring. And when after the Seminole Wars were over, Bailey bought the spring. So it was named after him initially. Then it was named Green Springs, and there are 2 stories behind that. Either named after a doctor who worked there or a farmer who was miraculously healed by the waters there. Then they didn't want to compete with Green Cove Springs, so they just named the town Safety Harbor and called the springs there instead of Santo Springs. And there are 5 or 6 springs there. I think they were originally located right near the bay, as you can see in these facilities from around the turn of the century. And you can see that buildings along the back of the doors are probably bathhouses. But like so many wooden buildings built along the waterfront, if there's a hurricane, look out. So those got wiped out, and they built these new facilities in the 1920s. And as you can see, they're no longer right on the water because they added all this fill into the bay to expand the property. So Bailey's son-in-law and daughter ran it, and they were named the Tuckers, and the Tuckers started the Espiritu Santo Springs Corporation, and they ran the facilities there in the 1920s. And this was during the Florida boom period when lots of people were coming to Florida, and Mediterranean revival style architecture was kind of the flavor of the day. So you can see no longer do we have wood structures. They're built in the new Mediterranean revival style. And what I love about this place that's still there today is they have a lot of respect for the history there. They have a history hall, and you can see, I'll show you the octagonal structure in the next slide. And they have a hotel room decorated as it would have been during the 1920s. So there's this uninterrupted use of the waters there that stretches back about 150 years. And again, the town of Safety Harbor is a town that isn't waiting for the boom. It has a lot of growth, and there's a lot to do there, but it still hasn't lost its charm. I highly recommend a visit there too. But I think drinking the water was more popular than bathing in the water there. So they used the 5 springs, or 4 of the springs, for different things. Spring number 1 was for stomach disorders, skin disorders. Spring number 2 was good for arthritis and rheumatism, kidneys, diabetes. And number 3, liver, gallbladder, and uses as a mild laxative. A lot of these waters had high amounts of magnesium in there. So if you drink them you get results. What I love also is that you can see the sign in the black and white is still there today if you go downstairs where the spring is, which is actually in the beauty salon. There's plexiglass on the floor and you can see PVC pipes, and that's all that's really there to see of the spring. But they pipe it into a swimming pool, and they have 3 or 4 different swimming pools, and they have hot tubs and all that, and that is the spring water after it's been processed a little bit. That you can't just use the pure spring water anymore. It has to go through reverse osmosis and all this other stuff. But it is essentially the water from the spring. And they have everything you could want out of a spa there, you know, seaweed treatments and aromatherapy and all that kind of stuff. But you could, this is the one place that still has a hotel above the spring where you can still stay. It's remarkable. This is another one from the Gulf Coast. I talked to somebody about Sarasota earlier. This is Northport. Northport was in the news recently because of that girl who got killed. That family lived in Northport, but Northport is a relatively new county. It's near Venice in Sarasota County. And of all the springs, this was developed the latest, but has the longest history because 20,000 years ago, after the ice age starts to end, Florida is about twice as wide as it is now. It was a dry and arid place. And so when people start coming down either across the land bridge, or some people say they may have come in boats from South America, when they got to Florida, water was a precious commodity because it was dry and arid. So there were places where there were sinkholes with water at the bottom. And we know that Warm Mineral Springs was that kind of place because it's shaped today, it's shaped like a sinkhole. In that narrow part, it's shaped like an hourglass. In the narrow part of the hourglass, there's all these incredible archaeological remains, and paleontological remains as well. So they found woolly mammoth and saber-toothed tiger skulls, as well as human remains. And we know they coexisted because in one instance, they found a spear point lodged in the skull of a saber-toothed tiger. And so people have been living there for thousands of years, and this place is a national landmark because of the amount of remains they found there. Unfortunately, a lot of them were discovered in the 40s and 50s by this guy who was not a professional archaeologist and just pulled the bones out willy-nilly. And there's one story where he was on live television, he pulls out the skull, and I don't know if he pops the brain out or not, but there was still gray matter in the skull, and they thought he was fooling, but because of the anaerobic conditions of the spring, it was preserved, even though it was thousands of years old. And there's also stories that he took some of the bones and incorporated them into his fireplace. So he was not using the archaeological techniques they use today. And so this, for a long time, people didn't believe it had this history, but we know it does. It really started being developed towards the end of the 19th century. This picture here is probably what it would have looked like about the same time people were staying at the Clarendon Hotel in Green Cove Springs. It was very primitive for a long time. And eventually it was owned by a Mrs. Brown, who was very wealthy. Her husband was from Philadelphia, and they wanted to build a spa there, but they never did. One of the stories is that Ringling, you followed Ringling Barnum and Bailey Circus, who built the place in Sarasota, wanted to buy this, offered them over $200,000, which was a lot of money at that time. And they turned it down because they wanted to build a spa there. They never really did, but it was open to the public. They would charge, like a dime to go into the water. But they built no facilities until the 1950s. And when they did, they built these incredible buildings because they wanted to take advantage of the state's quadricentennial, marking the beginning of habitation by Kristen de Luna in Pensacola and Pedro Menendez in St. Augustine. And they thought, well, we're right here on US 19. There would be people traveling back and forth. We'll have this big celebration and people stop and we'll be able to sell lots all around, real estate all around the spring. So they built these remarkable facilities, and they glommed onto the myth of the Fountain of Youth, which is what my first book is about, and tried to pawn themselves off as the Fountain of Youth. And they found this story that of this Friar Ortiz who showed Ponce de Leon the location, which was probably not true. It's a whole other talk I could do another time. But that round building on the slide on the left is actually a cyclorama that depicts the life of Ponce de Leon. You walk around and there's three-dimensional objects and murals talking about his life. And the building to the left are the spa facilities. And if you notice, they're shaped kind of like an hourglass to kind of echo the shape of the actual spring. And that was designed by a famous architect named Jack West in the early 1960s. And that's their depiction of the Fountain of Youth. And a couple of years ago, so people still use the spring today. It's very, very popular among Eastern Europeans. There's a lot of Eastern Europeans and Russians who have moved to Northport in order to take the waters on a daily basis. A couple of years ago, the property was owned jointly by the county of Sarasota and the town of Northport. They couldn't agree on the vendor to run the spring. So it closed. So you saw protests of all the bathers who couldn't get into the spring that they went every day because they were very upset. Because a lot of these people moved halfway around the world in order to take the waters there. So if you go today, it's completely owned by the town of Northport. They have big plans for this place. They're going to really develop the facilities there. It is warm compared to most of the springs. There's several events that come up and make the spring. And some of the events are very, very deep, and that's what makes it warmer. It's like 87 degrees. So on a hot summer days, it still seems cool, but in winter, I imagine it feels like a bath. It's also very different because it's not crystal clear like a lot of the other springs. The water's kind of murky. And this, a lot of the springs are in bad condition, so you're likely to see some algae floating around, but that's consistent with all the other springs in our state right now. Okay, time to shift gears. I want to talk about sea bathing, which is another way of taking the waters. And I want to talk about the origins of sea bathing that go back to ancient England, or not ancient England, I should say, 1600s and 1700s. There was a spa town in England called Scarborough, and a guy named Dr. John Floyer was writing a book about the spa there, and he proposed that in addition to drinking the mineral water, drinking seawater could be good for you, and bathing in seawater could be good for you. So he wrote about it in one of his books, and at the same time, a number of other books came out that proposed cold water bathing could be equally beneficial as warm water bathing in springs. And so you started seeing the same kind of resorts you saw at Springs pop up at places like Brighton and Margate and Blackpool, all around England, and eventually in France and Belgium. And sea bathing became as popular as bathing in mineral waters. And eventually that fad, of course, came across the country. So you started to see popular bathing places like Coney Island, and Newport, Rhode Island became very popular. And the thing about sea bathing was it wasn't as reliant on transportation because the beach was much more accessible. So the heyday of sea bathing in Florida was really right around the turn of the century at the resorts of Henry Flagler. And Henry Flagler was a railroad and Standard Oil magnate who built a series of railroads along the east coast of Florida, all the way from Atlantic Beach and Jacksonville down to Key West, and built these beautiful resorts along the way. You may have anyone seen Flagler College in St. Augustine, the beautiful building, and the Alcazar Hotel, which is the Leitner Museum. Those are two Henry Flagler resorts. And Palm Beach was kind of the place, and he put Palm Beach on the map, and that's where people went for sea bathing. And you can see the people here. And I want to point out, can you see across the top third of the picture, the lines going across? The picture going from into the surf? Those are safety lines, because for a long time, people who were wealthy looked down their nose at people who could swim, because they had indoor plumbing and they didn't need to learn how to swim. And people who didn't were the unwashed masses who had to go to lakes, rivers, and streams in order to bathe. So it wasn't until 1850 that swimming started to catch on and become more popular. But around the turn of the century, there were still a lot of people who could not swim, who believed in going into the seawater was good for you. But in order to do that, they had to use a safety line. And you see that this not just for sea bathing, but at springs too. Generally, there is a line going across for people who want to bathe, but don't know how to swim yet. And what changed in some of these resorts that Flagler owned was he started building these saltwater pools, and he would have swim instructors. And eventually, swimming went from a therapeutic practice to a recreational practice. And that kind of when sea bathing, as it was called, sea bathing, became less popular and recreational bathing kind of took over. This is one of the images I like. It's on the back of my book, showing this woman clutching the safety line very, very closely. So if cold water of swimming in the ocean is good for you, why can't any water be good for you? So eventually this whole hydrotherapy practice related to just regular tap water begins to develop based on the ancient practice of taking the waters from mineral springs and sea bathing. And so this is Florida Sanitarium in Orlando that opened up on Lake Estelle, where they use the water from the lake there for hydrotherapy. And it all kind of comes out of the sanitarium movement. Sanitariums were there for people who were consumptives in order to give them places to be removed from everyone else and to be outside. You see, this is where the sanitarium movement started in New York. See all the porches along these buildings allow people to be outside. Oftentimes they would take the beds outside so people could sleep in the outdoors because it was believed to be so healthy. And so the sanitary movement caught on and they started building these facilities all over the country, and naturally Florida would eventually have their own. The most famous though was Battle Creek Sanitarium. You've all heard of Kellogg's cereal. Well, that was an invention of either John Harvey Kellogg or Will Kellogg. There's still debate which brother invented it. But John Harvey Kellogg was the man behind the Battle Creek Sanitarium. Thousands of people went there in the Victorian era in order to get well and to learn a healthy lifestyle. The man behind it was John Harvey Kellogg, who was this larger than life character. If you've seen the movie Road to Wellville, they kind of parody that what would go on at those places. That's actually an inset of it in the slide before. He really believed in the power of water, and he wrote several books on hydrotherapeutic practices in order to get healthy. And that was a large part of the regimen you would learn. But you also, it was healthy living, so you would have vegetarian diets. And he was way ahead of some of this stuff. In some cases, in other ways, he had some very, very wacky beliefs, but he was larger than life, but very, very famous nationwide. So when he decided to open a sanitarium in Florida, different cities competed in order to be the spot for that. And eventually Miami Springs won. And Miami Springs, this beautiful building on the left, was built by the aviation pioneer Glenn Curtis and his partner Bright, and they developed the town of Opelika in South Florida, and they built this as a hotel and country club. And then it was right around the end of the 1920s, and you know what happened at the end of the 1920s, the Great Depression, the big bust. And so he had this huge property he didn't want. So the story is, there's two stories. One story is he sold it to John Harvey Kellogg for $1. And the other story is told by John Harvey Kellogg. He said $1 isn't enough and gave him 10. For anyways, John Harvey Kellogg opened the Battle Creek Sanitarium in Miami Springs. And you can see that's a more contemporary shot of some of the hydrotherapy stuff, like getting hit with a hose and taking a bath. There's more to it than that, but I'm just being silly. Another sanitarium that happened was not too far from here. Do you know the town of Tangerine, which is just south of Mount Dora? There was a guy named Dr. Benedict Moose, who was a proponent of this naturopathic system called the NEEP system, which developed in Eastern Europe. And a lot of it had to do with water, wrapping yourself with wet towels, getting up in the morning and walking barefoot through the grass covered with dew, things like that. And it was very popular for invalids. Lust himself was ill and he went back to Germany, and I guess this is really the Czech Republic, and learned the system and was healed. And he came back to the United States to teach people this. So this guy is considered one of the fathers of naturopathy in the United States. And it's very likely he opened the very first health food store in the United States. And his sanitarium was called Youngborn, which I think means be young again. And it was an hour's train ride from New York City and Butler, New Jersey. But like Kellogg, he decided he had to find a warmer environment. So he came down to Florida and opened one on the shores of Lake Ola in Tangerine, Florida. And it called it Casey Sauna, which was the same name as the hotel in Santo Springs, which means here is health. And he opened it in 1913. In 1943, there was a fire. Several of the guests were killed, and Lust himself was wounded. He died as a result of his wounds several years later. Another aspect of hydrotherapy is the resorts and hotels of that time had hydrotherapy facilities inside the hotels, at least several of them. I'd love to find more, but the best example is at the former Alcazar Hotel in St. Augustine, which is today the Leitner Museum in St. Augustine City Hall. And much of them are still on display. And so here's a promotional brochure for the facilities there, and you can see all the different things they had. Tonic baths, Turkish baths, steam spout baths, Roman baths, Russian baths, you name it. And then there's that new hydrotherapeutic apparatus, which is basically a series of nozzles which water would be directed to you at very high pressure, and it was believed that the pressure of that would shake things loose in your body, and eventually you would purge it out. And that cabinet is still there today, and much of the facilities there are part of the Leitner Museum that you can still tour, which for somebody who kind of geeks out on stuff like this, it's very exciting to see those things still in existence. So this is either the Russian bath or the Turkish bath. I'm not sure. They called it the Senate because everybody would be wrapped in togas, kind of. And then that's the needle shower. I've done a needle shower in Hot Springs because they still have some of the hydrotherapy facilities there. And it's not as bad as it sounds. It's a lot of fun, actually. But it's very fun to tour. I recommend the Leitner Museum too. Florida water had such a name that most of these places bottled the water because drinking the water was a big part of it. And so there was several places where people just dug wells and sold it as spring water. And the great example is this. This is Orange City Mineral Water. Orange City is along the St. Johns River in Volusia County. And it was very popular. Another story goes that John D. Rockefeller loved this water so much that he would buy bottles and volumes and take it with him wherever he went to bathe in and to drink. And eventually the city of Orange City bought the well that this was, the water came from and tapped it, so you can't get it anymore. But as you well know, there's a lot of water that comes from Florida today. Zephyr Hills is a great example. A lot of this major springs have bottling plants next to them. And a lot of the water you buy in Publix and Walmart, places like that, is actually bottled from the aquifer here in Florida because we are blessed with this huge Florida aquifer with quadrillion gallons of water, and it's still believed to be good, healthy water. But that's not necessarily the case. I want to talk about the state of the waters and why I think this is important to us today. Hampton Springs was a spring that was near the town of Perry in Taylor County, kind of in the Big Bend area where the Panhandle meets the peninsula of Florida. And it was developed later. There was, started out very crude with a log cabin, but eventually they built this big resort that appealed to people from Chicago who would take the railroad there. And it's kind of like a country club. You could come there and take the waters, go hunting and fishing, fish in the Gulf. And it was very popular. And you could see people there filling their big jugs of water. And it was sold at pharmacies all across the South. A lot of these places did the same thing. Well, the hotel eventually went away. There were, in World War II, I think there were soldiers stationed nearby, but it fell into disrepair. And the whole practice of taking the waters in this country, became less popular the later we got into the 20th century. It's still very popular in other places. In Europe, you can go and your healthcare system will pay for you to take the waters. And there's a whole huge bathing tradition in Japan, where hot springs are still very, very popular, but not in this country. So these places became archaeological ruins. Taylor County got a bunch of grants and they surveyed what had been the property where the hotel was, and they turned it into a park. And my friend John Moran photographed this at night. He lit up the spring in order to photograph it and get this shot to me that encapsulates kind of the mystery of what you might have seen in the ancient Greek and Roman times of these bathing places. But the county could not enforce or keep this place safe. And they were afraid somebody, the swimming part is in the back. They were afraid somebody's going to break their back or crack their skull or something like that. So they built a large fence around it. People would come in with their pickup trucks and just pull the fences away. So eventually they filled it with concrete. And people who lived in Taylor County were so angry and so mad that they really let their county commissioners have it. So eventually they removed all the concrete and opened it up again. They're still not sure what to do. Last I heard, they were trying to find somebody who would live on property in order to keep the yahoos out. But it's a remarkable remnant of this time that really, if you connect the dots from our economy today and go back in time, the foundation of our tourist economy was in some part based on invalids coming to the state. And you know, the ancient beliefs that all water is related to life. You know, there's indigenous beliefs that the earth emerged on the back of a turtle. And then there's beliefs in the spirituality of water. If you go to places like Lourdes in France, you know, that water has healing properties. You know, we have connections to that in our state. And if we put concrete chunks in these places, we lose that connection to those stories. And there are still people who come here to the state in large numbers in order to swim in the springs, go to the beaches, and take advantage of our waters. If we lose that connection, we lose a big part of our history and we risk our health. And that's the irony of it. You know, they came here for healthful purposes. Our springs are in very bad shape. You know, our beaches, we have red tide and all these other things. So I think it's important to keep these places, this is Swanee Springs, intact so we can learn the lessons they have to tell us. Okay. I would love to answer any questions you might have. I have books on sale. They make great Christmas presents. I appreciate you inviting me here, and it's so nice to have an in-person talk again. So does anyone have any questions? Has anybody been to any of the springs in Florida, any of the places I've showed, or where have you been?
Well, of course, we've been to Sulphur Springs.
Sulphur Springs?
I think everybody has, but yeah, we paddle a lot. So we paddle in a lot of springs, a lot of small springs and so forth. One of the things that was kind of interesting too is when you have some of the rivers go underground that reappear, you know, later on, like from the Lapa back into the Swanee. So it's almost like a spring, but it's tan and water.
Yeah, like I know the Santa Fe does that.
Yeah.
Where it goes under. Yeah, you know, the hydrogeology of Florida is incredibly mysterious and fascinating. And I love seeing those pictures of the cave divers. Well, you know, there's huge caverns underneath the state. And one of the things I learned in the process of writing these books is we're just really starting to get a handle on the hydrogeology and how fast, you know, water gets into our springs from the land. And it used to be thought that it took thousands of years for it to percolate to the limestone. But we know, like around the Cove Springs where there's sinkholes, water gets in there fast. And it's just a matter of days before it goes from being on land to coming up in the spring. But it is, we're lucky to live in a state that has such resources or beauty.
There's some places where there's a sink in high water table.
Yeah, there's sinks and swallets and swales and all these things, and I don't understand completely the difference between all of them. But I have a lot of friends who live in North Florida, you know, along the Swanee and the Itchitucky, where all those different features exist, and it's fascinating. And some of them, you know, are kind of scary too. You know, we get sucked in, and, you know, but it's wonderful. And you know, it's interesting to me too that some of the places you'd never swim, you know, that are sinkholes with water are you know, there's karst windows where people can go in and dive and get into the aquifer and come up another place. There's a remarkable documentary called Water's Journey where they actually do this in Central Florida. They follow divers who are going through the aquifer, these underground rivers, with a radio antenna on land.
Yeah.
If you've seen it,
Sunny barbecue restaurant.
exactly.
He's right underneath. He's right underneath.
It's right by the salad bar.
Yeah.
It's so much fun.
Yeah, I was gonna ask you if you had seen that,
I-
because that's what I was thinking about too.
Yeah, I'm too scared. I'm too big a chicken to be a cave diver. Honestly, when you know, if you have a mask and you just swim over some of these deep holes and you don't see the bottom, that's scary enough for me. I have no desire to swim down and try and get in those, but I know people who do, and they're, you know, they are very, very careful because people die every year doing that if you don't know what they're doing, but not for me.
I went to Deleon Springs in Ocala, and it's beautiful, it's huge, and there's a really cool little restaurant there where you cook your own everything, you cook your own eggs, your own stuff. So anyway, it's a constant 72 degrees there. And everybody that I was with didn't want to swim, but I love that water. I'm from north. So I went in, I'm swimming long, so I was trying to swim the whole thing. I got in the middle, I needed to tread water, catch my breath to continue on to the next side. And I look over and there's this little sea otter. He's just sitting there on his back, just looking at me about 5 feet away. I was like, oh, what do I do?
Oh,
I just
wow.
kept swimming and he just kept swimming around and that was that. Wow, that was really weird.
Yeah, I've
Little sea otter.
never, that would be really fun.
Yeah.
De Leon Springs is one of my favorite places. There is incredible history there. Audubon stayed there. You know, it was a plantation, so it has a plantation history. It was destroyed during the Civil War. It was destroyed during one of the Seminole Wars because there was a mill there, and it was one of the. And that's so the restaurant's called the Old Spanish Mill, and they have a griddle. You basically sit around a griddle, and they bring you the stone ground flour, and you pour your own pancakes, which is a wonderful thing. But there's a long history there. It's in both books because they wanted to have it be a spa for some point. But I really think that was more of a marketing angle than actually in having invalids there. At some point, they tried to raise the water level and expand the pool, but the weight of the water was so much that the spring couldn't come up. So it popped up at a different place in the spring run. So they had to go back and put concrete in the hole that popped up in order to get the water to flow back where they
I
wanted
did
it.
see some weird concrete, like, variations along the edges. I thought they were trying to make kids areas or something. I really couldn't figure it out.
It was a full-on theme park at one point. They had a water skiing elephant. They had a monkey island. They had a circus. They had a ski jump. So the place where they kind of made an island out of the spot in the middle where they had to pour the concrete. And so they would have a boat that would jump. They put a little ramp on it and the boat would jump, and water ski shows like Cypress Stars. It was a really big deal for a short time. Now it's a state park. And there's 2 Ponce de Leon Springs in the state that are state parks. One's in the Panhandle, which is kind of crazy. What?
Small springs that dry up, we talked, some people when they were really small, they just go swim in there, spring like that, come up that big brook. And Suffolk County. Then they did some rock climbing and they disturbed the spring, warm springs there, where the villages are now. There's a spring running down through there too. I think around 1960, but rock climbing had to do some dynamite and then blowing up some rock for mining and disturbed that.
Yeah, that's happened a couple of times. There's one I talk about in my book, and I can't remember the name of it right now, where they tried to make it bigger. It's like don't mess with Mother Nature, so they put dynamite in it and filled it. But I think I know that there's a number of small springs along like Lake Griffin and stuff somewhere that I've always wanted to go and try to explore them. I know Bow Spring is a big one here.
Yeah.
It's like the military.
Oklahoma, yeah.
Yeah, the Navy owns it.
Yeah.
They do sonar testing.
So there's a lot of them around, but it's interesting because Warm Mineral Springs in the book is pretty much the furthest south. There's some north of Orlando, and there's one called Lithia Springs in Hillsborough County. But once you get south of there, there's not a whole lot of springs. Bonita Springs supposedly had a spring. But the Florida Aquifer really only goes down to about 2/3 of the spring, and then there's the Biscayne Aquifer below that.
Yeah, there's a Miami, there's a town called Miami Springs. Was there a spring there at one time?
Not that I know of.
Okay.
Of
Of course, there's Hollywood Hills too. There's no hills in Hollywood.
There's so many places where I look at it and it's like they called it a spring, and I think it's just an artesian well. In Enterprise, there are a lot of springs. The big one there is Green Springs. But they had this one, and you can see these people around. It looks like a water fountain, and I'm sure it's a well because you can tell the difference between a spring well. But there was so much pressure before we started really tapping the aquifer that you could pretty much make a spring if you dug a well deep enough, because the pressure of the water would come up. And there's stories about how the boils of the springs would be so they would come up feet off the surface of the water because of the amount of water coming out. I saw a picture of the Christmas tree display they had around Santo Springs. And there's a beautiful photo because the Christmas tree's here. And there's a perfect reflection of it in the spring. But the surface is perfectly smooth, which means there's not hardly any pressure interrupting that surface, which means the flow is just not there right now.
Orange groves, like in Indian River County, they have a lot of artesian wells. I mean, they pumped a huge amount of water out of the ground there. And, a lot of times being corrosive, they corrode the pipe away, and lots of times when they weren't doing farming anymore, so
The water is
water just, yeah, just flowing out of from the upper till the water management from the cap them all.
Yeah, I think there's places like that all over. And whenever I find one, I get all excited. There's one on Clifton Springs on Lake Jessup that's kind of got a faucet on it now. But, you know, that's where people would stop for years and fill up their water because they knew it was good. But I think the state is capped pretty much by itself.
You know, the Waha, when they do a drawdown, the Hampton Springs, you know.
Yeah, I've been there a couple times during drawdown. I swam in, I think it's Blue. There's about 7 Blue Springs in Florida, but I think there's one in Aqua. No, it's Canton. Swam in Canton, which is exciting because, you know, it's there under pounds and pounds and pounds of water and I'm struggling to survive. So that's a whole other issue. So you guys have paddled during the drawdown?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's exciting. I like the part where all the stumps are because it has a, it's kind of eerie.
It is.
It's remarkable. We got, thank you guys for coming out. If you want a book, I got some.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.